Chapter 14. The Aridi coast was a thin brown line off the starboard side as Wolfwind slipped smoothly through the water. It was strangely quiet now that the crew had been able to ship their oars and set the big square sail. For the past 4 days, the wind had blown steadily from the east, directly opposed to their direction of travel. But as the sun had risen on this, the 15th day of their journey, the wind had shifted to the south. Svengal had the yard arm raised and braced round to an angle of 45 degrees to catch the wind. The wolf ship tried to turn upwind immediately, like a weather vane. But Svengal's firm control of sheets and tiller kept the bow pointed east. Wolfwind still crabbed to the north, inevitably, but the conflicting forces created by the wind in the sail, the resistance of the keel in the water, and the turning force of the rudder resolved themselves into an east-northeast course for the ship. And even if she was losing some ground to the north, she was making better progress to the east than she would under oars. Svengal knew that a wise captain conserved the strength of his oarsmen as far as possible. "We're making some northing," he told Holt, "but we'll stay with the wind until we're closer to Al-Shabaab." Holt nodded agreement. Svengal knew what he was doing, and there was nothing that the ranger could suggest to improve their progress. He trusted the big Scandian's skill and judgment almost as much as he trusted Erak's. Holt, Evelyn, and Svengal were deep in conversation now in the stern part of the ship, discussing plans for the coming negotiations. Horace was crouched beside Kicker in his pen, working to remove a stone that had become wedged under the battle horse's shoe on their last run ashore. Will stood alone in the very bow of the ship, chin resting on his forearm as he leaned on the bulwark. For perhaps the 10th time in as many days, he was feeling uneasy about what the future might hold. Not the negotiations for Erak's release. He was certain that they would proceed smoothly and successfully. After all, Holt would be beside Evelyn to guide her and advise her of any possible pitfalls. And that was the crux of it, he realized. He had spent the better part of the last 5 years relying on Holt, trusting his judgment, following his lead, just as they would all be doing when the ship finally reached Al-Shabaab and they went ashore to rescue Erak. Holt's presence, his foresight, his skill, his innate ability to solve any problem that raised itself, was an enormous source of security for Will. He was firmly convinced that there was nothing Holt couldn't do, no problem that he couldn't solve. And soon, Will knew, he would be leaving that protective umbrella and striking out on his own. In 3 months' time, he would face his final assessment tests, designed to ascertain whether or not he had what it took to be a successful ranger. For the past year, this final assessment had loomed large in his mind. He had seen it as the culmination of his training, the final hurdle that he must leap before he received the silver oak leaf, symbol of a graduate ranger. And he'd looked forward to it with some impatience. But now, he realized, the assessment would not be the end. It would merely be the beginning of a new and even larger phase of his life. The real assessment would follow, and it would never cease for as long as he remained a ranger. Every day he would be tested. He would be called on to make life or death decisions, sometimes without enough time to consider them properly. People would look to him for advice and leadership, and suddenly he doubted that he could provide it. He realized now that he wasn't ready for the role. He wasn't up to it. He could never be like Holt, so calm, self-assured, experienced, so incontrovertibly right about everything. He wasn't Holt, he was Will, young, impulsive, green as grass. Without really thinking about it, He had somehow assumed that once he had graduated, he and Holt would continue to live in the comfortable little cabin just inside the edge of the forest. But Holt's marriage had brought Will to the realization that those days were nearly over, and Holt realized it, even if Will hadn't. Holt had already moved into the apartment that he and Lady Pauline shared at the castle, although he would continue to use the cabin in the forest as a base for his observation of the goings-on in the Fife. At first, Will had viewed the change in circumstances with equanimity. The idea of having the cabin mostly to himself had a certain appeal. He could invite friends over for meals. Horace, if he happened to be visiting Redmond, as he did from time to time, and Alice. Alice, he thought. Yes, it would be pleasant to sit by the fire in the cosy little cabin with the beautiful, tall blonde girl, talking over old times and new developments in their jobs. She was already a graduate courier and already being sent on missions by her mentor, Lady Pauline. Alice enjoyed sitting with him, listening to him play the mandola, nodding her head in time to the beat. Unlike Holt, he thought with a wry smile, who groaned and fidgeted whenever Will produced the little instrument from its hard leather case. But then he realized that would not be the way his life went. He wouldn't be in the cabin with or without Holt. He wouldn't be anywhere near Castle Redmond. Once he graduated, he would be assigned to another fief, one of 50 throughout the kingdom. He could be sent hundreds of kilometers away from everyone and everything he knew. And when he got there, people would expect him to know what he was doing. They would look to him for guidance and advice and protection. In short, they would think he was like Holt. And he knew all too well that he wasn't. He sighed deeply at the thought. "There's a happy sound," a cheerful voice said at his elbow. He started with surprise. Even engrossed in his thoughts as he had been, he would have expected to be aware of anyone approaching him so closely. Anyone but Gillen, he corrected himself. Possibly Holt, but definitely Gillen. The young ranger seemed to be able to move in total silence when he chose to. He was the Ranger Corps' recognized master of unseen movement. Gillen leaned now on the rail beside Will, looking at him curiously. "Something on your mind?" he asked quietly. Gillen knew from his own experience that there were some problems that an apprentice didn't want to ask his mentor about. He knew, too, that he was in a unique position. As a former apprentice to Holt himself, he could understand most of the doubts that might be going through Will's mind at the moment. In fact, Gillen had a pretty shrewd idea as to why Will was sighing. "No, well, I suppose. Sort of. Well, yes," Will said. Gillen's smile widened. "And there's a choice of 3 answers for me. Never let it be said that you don't answer a question thoroughly." Will essayed a smile in return, but it was a wan little effort. "Gil," he said finally, "when you were about to take the silver, did you think you were—" He hesitated, not sure how to put it, then tried another tack. "I mean, did you feel sort of—" He was about to say inadequate, but he couldn't imagine the word applying to Gillen. Gillen had a claim on Will's respect that was second only to Holt's. He was an expert archer like all rangers. But unlike any of the others, he was also a master swordsman. He alone of the 50 serving rangers carried a sword in addition to the regular ranger weapons. He was also, as Will had just been reminded, an expert in the art of silent movement. And he was respected among the corps by other rangers, far senior to him in years. On several occasions, Will had heard Crowley and Holt discussing Gillen's future in the corps, and he knew that Gillen was marked down for high office. The fact that this might have something to do with Gillen's being Holt's former apprentice didn't occur to Will. But the word inadequate would be an insult to someone as capable and skilled as Gillen. Gillen studied the troubled young man beside him and felt a surge of affection for him. "Were you going to say unready?" he asked, and Will seized on the word gratefully. It was less insulting than the one he had nearly used. "Yes, exactly. Did you feel unready for it all?" Gillen nodded several times before answering. His smile became a little wistful as he thought back to those days years ago when he felt exactly the same doubts he was sure Will was feeling now. "You know, a year before my finals, I was quite sure I knew it all." "Well, yes, of course," Will said. Gillen would have been more than ready a year before most apprentices. Then he realized that a year ago, he had felt exactly the same way. He turned to look at the tall ranger. "Then," Gillen continued, "in my last few weeks, I realized how much I didn't know." "You?" Will said incredulously. "But you're—" Gillen held up a hand to silence him. "I started thinking, what am I going to do without Holt to advise me? What will I do when he's not around to clear up the mistakes I make?" And the whole thing had me shaking in my boots. I thought, I can't possibly do this job. I can't be Holt. How can I ever be as wise and clever and, let's face it, as downright sneaky as he is? "Is that pretty much the way you're feeling now?" he concluded. Will was shaking his head in amazement. "That's it in a nutshell. How can I be like Holt? How can anyone?" Again, the enormity of it all weighed down on him, and his shoulders slumped. Gillen put a comforting arm around them. "Will, the very fact that you're worrying about it says you'll be up to the job. Remember, nobody expects you to be Holt. He's a legend after all. Haven't you heard? He's 8 foot tall and kills bears with his bare hands." Will had to smile at that. Holt's reputation throughout the kingdom was pretty much the way Gillen had stated it. People meeting him for the first time were surprised to find he was actually a little smaller than average. So you can't possibly live up to that. But remember this, you have been trained by the very best in the business, and you've been privileged to stand beside him for the past 5 years and see how he approaches a problem. Believe me, a lot of that rubs off. Once you have your own fife, you'll soon realize how much you do know. "But what if I make a mistake?" Will asked. Gillen threw back his head and laughed. "A mistake? One mistake? You should be so lucky. You'll make dozens. I made 4 or 5 on my first day. Of course you'll make mistakes. Just don't make any of them twice. If you do mess things up, don't try to hide it. Don't try to rationalize it. Recognize it and admit it and learn from it. We never stop learning, none of us. Not even Holt," he added seriously. Will nodded his gratitude. He felt a little better. He cocked his head suspiciously. "You're not just saying this to make me feel better, are you?" Gillen shook his head. "Oh no. If you don't believe me, ask Holt to tell you about some of my whoppers. He loves reminding me of them. Now, let's go see what they've been talking about so seriously." And with his arm around the younger man's shoulders still, he led him away from the bow and back to the small group by the tiller. Holt glanced up as they approached, caught a look from Gillen, and had a pretty shrewd idea what they had been talking about. "Where have you two been?" he asked, his tone light. "Admiring the view," Gillen told him. "Thought you might need some advice from the 2 wisest heads on board." Holt said nothing, but his suddenly raised eyebrow spoke volumes.